event we've done recently. To give the background, we actually had this room booked for a very worthy ministerial speech with a minister, and obviously everything went into complete chaos, and we thought, well, we might as well use the booking to get the best possible panel we have of and probably the only people in the country who haven't actually, certainly in the Conservative movement, who haven't actually endorsed a candidate. Amazing panel. I mean, I don't think any of them need introduction, but from left to right is Lord Frost, formerly the Brexit negotiator for Boris Johnson and one of his senior ministers, and now a Telegraph columnist and a Tribune of the True Faith. Rachel Wolfe, who was the co-creator of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto and runs the brilliant company Public First, and is also on the board of the Centre for Policy Studies. So generally excellent life choices all around.
I just want to work with you some more, Rob.
I'm Robert Colvile, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies. To my right is Professor Matt Goodwin, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, and has asked me to tell everyone that he has, like everyone else in the world, launched a Substack, which will feature exclusive polling on the of Conservative members, or just on the Conservative
members, voters, red wallers, everybody.
Brilliant. So if you want to get the absolute latest, tune into that. And then I'm afraid Will Tanner has had a childcare crisis, and as Penny Mordaunt reminded us today in the Times, childcare is very important and family is very important. So he's having to look after his kid, but he has sent along Adam Hawksby, who is the Deputy Director of Reform and has promised to be just as squishily left-wing as sorry, some sort of nonsense about needing to pay for tax cuts. I mean, I don't know myself. We're going to try and have some quick introductory remarks from the panelists, then get a conversation going and have questions from you guys. So yeah, let's kick off with well, actually from left to right. What are your sort of opening thoughts on the campaign? I mean, are there particular things you've been surprised by in what we've seen so far?
So thanks, Robert. Just before I answer your question, just to say one of the things you didn't mention in your enumeration of things I'm doing is that I am at Policy.
Sorry. That wasn't a deliberate.
No. I mention it because I hopefully will have one or two things coming out under their auspices quite soon. So I mentioned that, and also just to apologise, I've got to leave about 10 or 15 minutes early, so it doesn't look like I've walked out in protest at 11:45. Has anything surprised me? No, not really. I think it's good that we're having the debate that we are having at the moment. I'm not one of those who thinks it's bad that candidates are criticising each other and what they are standing for. I think that's good. It's a debate that we need to have. And given how compressed a lot of this campaign is, the more exposure and the more ideas people are forced to come clean about and talk about and defend, the better, it seems to me. So that's important. You know, when I look at this, and as Robert said, I have not endorsed anybody yet. I might in the days to come, for what that's worth. For me, the important thing is we need to double down on the change of direction that Brexit implied. As I've said already, we don't need continuity Philip Hammond as our economic policy. We've got to do things that are different, look different, are different, distinguish us from the European Union, takes in a direction if we're going to succeed. And I despair slightly, I must admit, when I read articles like the one by my fellow peer Danny Finkelstein this morning, the sort of world weariness of the establishment that says nothing can be done, it's all too difficult. This sort of false analogy that comparing us to the socialists who never got real socialism, people like me who never got real Brexit. I just think it's absurd. The goal we've got to get to is reviving the sustainability, as a buzzword, of the British state. And the British state was a lot smaller under Tony Blair. That is still in living memory, and a lot of people thought that was quite a good time. And I don't know why it seems such an impossible object to get back to tax and spend levels of that era. So that's what I think we need free markets. We need to stand up for the union, for the country. We need to get the state smaller, and we need to get everybody more prosperous. And that's what I'm looking for in this as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Before I go to Rachel, I should just flag, if you haven't seen the sign, the Wi-Fi here is 1011 CHD and the password is hospitality. Might save people some bandwidth or say any signal problems. Rachel.
Thank you. I think you're going to get a range of opinion on this panel, so that's going to be interesting. I am very worried after having seen the last few days that the leadership contenders have completely misunderstood why we are in this position. The reason we are in this position is not because we got pummeled at the last election. We won with 80 seats after a Brexit campaign that also won and which shared a number of things in common. The Brexit campaign, you'll all remember, offered 350 million a week to the NHS, and it talked about immigration. And the campaign in 2019 promised to get Brexit done, yes, but talked about an Australian points system. It talked about funding for public services. It talked about extremely tangible delivery for a large number of people who had felt left behind in parts of the country for a long time, while balancing this, I think, very intelligently, and this was not my strategy, this I inherited when I came to do the manifesto, with continuing to offer enough fiscal responsibility and semi-pro-business rhetoric to the traditional Conservative base. And it created an electoral coalition. And the reason that the Conservatives are doing so badly in the polls is not because people have wholesale rejected that. It's because they got really angry with Boris Johnson and what they perceived to be hypocrisy, bad behavior, lying. And because they are seeing absolutely no delivery. So what I am a little puzzled by over the last few days is the belief that we should junk everything that led us to win in the first place. I'm also slightly astonished that no one, as far as I can see, has talked about delivering any of the things we promised. In 2 years, we're going to be going back to the electorate, and they will legitimately ask, what did you do? And we'll get onto the tax cut debate, and I have, my own views on this, but simply saying that in the last 6 months we cut some taxes is not going to be sufficient to show our competence. And I'm very, very worried about this. I think we are potentially heading for electoral oblivion because we do not understand that in 2024 we have to have demonstrated that we are capable of delivering something. So I also think that it is great that we're having a debate. I understand that leaders have to demonstrate their principles and that they have ideas, although I think we have been thinner on ideas so far than I might have hoped. But I also think we need to see more understanding of how we got here and why we got here, and therefore what is necessary next than I've seen so far.
No?
I agree with much of what's just been said. One of my colleagues, Professor Andrew Gamble, once said that one of the biggest puzzles in British politics is why the Conservative Party has been so successful for so long. If you look at all of the years since people were given the vote, the Conservative Party has governed alone or in opposition for about 72% of the time. By the time of the next election, we'll be close to about 75%. The answer to that puzzle is reinvention. And the Conservative Party historically has always reinvented at to meet the moment. And over the last 5 years, we can all see how the Conservative Party has reinvented itself once again to meet this new realignment that's sweeping through not just Britain, but also global politics. And that's given the Conservative Party a fundamentally different electorate from the one that David Cameron had in 2015, much more working class, much more non-graduate, a little bit older, a little bit whiter, also much more culturally conservative, much more committed to Brexit, much more committed to lowering immigration, much more committed to defending and promoting what voters want to see, Britain's distinctive identity, history, and all of those things. So that realignment is still entirely visible. Yes, polls fluctuate up and down, but the the shifts that we've seen since the 2019 election, whether in Hartlepool, whether in the local elections this year, actually point to the continued relevance of that. But it also has introduced a number of tensions, which I think this leadership election really needs to address and hasn't really been addressing yet. One is tax and spend. If you look at many of the voters who have come to the Conservative Party from Labour, particularly in the Red Wall, they're not supportive of slashing taxes as many Conservative MPs and many older Conservative voters. They are pretty on the fence, actually. They often say they'd like to keep taxes as they are, to invest in public services. About 3 in 10, close to a third, say that actually they'd like to increase taxes a little bit to invest in public services, health, education, those kinds of things. They're also disconnected from the parliamentary party on migration, which is I personally think is going to be another big problem for the party in the years ahead. They don't buy the argument that, well, migration's been reformed, therefore it's not an issue. They still think it's way too high. They still want it to come down. And I think also more generally, we're seeing much more of an interest, which is partly reflected in the leadership campaign, in these new cultural issues that have been bubbling to the surface. So when I poll Conservative voters, Conservative members, Red Wallers, actually they do really care about the culture stuff, free speech, council culture, what's happening to our institutions, the teaching of children, the politicization of children, as many people see it, and they want to talk about that. And I do actually think it's quite significant that some of the candidates have taken a very strong position on that. I think this is the mainstreaming of that discussion in British politics. I don't think those issues will go back. But the question then is, well, what do you do about that? I think there have been some interesting policy proposals put forward around universities. You know, I'm somebody that's campaigned for the higher education academic freedom bill, for example. That's really important. Also schools, some of the proposals that have been put forward around childcare and family. All of these things I think are quite important in terms of the realignment. But David is spot on when he says that continuity just won't work. Continuity with the past won't work to hold this coalition together. And I think all of the Conservative candidates now have to try and get themselves much better in line with the party's new electoral coalition, because the nightmare scenario, and I know Robert's written about this in the Sunday Times and so on, but there is a nightmare scenario for the Conservatives. London, university towns, commuter belt, in my personal view, are not going to come back to the Conservatives at the next election. This isn't about Boris Johnson. This is fundamentally about Brexit and about a party that they see as being fundamentally out of tune with their vision of Britain. So that really only leaves the Conservative Party with one strategy, which is to lean into the transformation of British politics that is now underway, to try and extend and expand many of those areas that the party won in 2019. And there are about 30 seats in the North Midlands that the Conservatives can continue to eat into to offset losses in Surrey, Hampshire, and all those kinds of areas. Now, if the party wants to do that, then this leadership election is going to have to start producing policies and ideas that better resonate with those voters. If it doesn't do that, the scenario is a nightmare scenario. It will lose London and a lot of those true blue Southern Shires. Lib Dems will do well. Labour will continue to expand out of London. And Red Wallers and blue collar Conservatives will stay at home because they won't find certain candidates appealing, or they won't feel that the Conservative Party is really in touch with who they are. Some polling yesterday, Redfield and Wilton made this point quite convincingly. Many Red Wallers see some of the most prominent candidates in this race as being very out of touch with their daily life and their lived experiences and so on. So I think this is a very fragile moment for the party. I think it's obviously a very important, critical moment for the party. It's either going to go very well, and the party will retain power, or this could actually quite quickly end up being a disaster. So watch and wait.
On which encouraging note, Adam, though I think Will's given you his notes, so we should sense his spirit hovering over your remarks there.
Yeah, indeed. This was not a good day to run about 20 minutes from our offices. So I want to make kind of 3 points in opening about how we need to think about the next, this leadership debate, but also the next 5, 10, 15 years. I want to talk about the electorate that we inherited, and Rachel and Matt have both touched on that. The values that should inform the debate, why we need a bit of a rebalance between the discussion about freedom and a discussion about belonging and security, which I think has been really forgotten. And a quick conversation about what the state should do, because we have a lot of conversation about size, but not about purpose. I'll start with a quote that admittedly did come from Will's notes and I haven't researched in the last 20 minutes. The battle within the party is a fight between the Tory individualists who follow, ironically enough, the creed of 19th century liberalism, and the Tory reformers who raised the banner of Disraeli's Young England. I could very easily apply to today's context. That was from Lord Beaverbrook in 1945. This debate is not a new one. It's not because of Brexit. It's not because the Conservative Party have been in government for a long time. It is not because of the individuals' personalities that are in this race. It is something which is part of the broad church of conservatism and the Conservative Party. And I do believe it is a positive thing that we are having this debate again, and will continue to, between a version of conservatism, which is much more about a sort of liberty, and another which is more about a form of reforming belonging. David Willits described this recently, or actually 10, 20 years ago, as the balance in conservatism between roots and wings. And I think at times the roots have been forgotten in favour of those wings, while both are important. Let's talk about the electorate very quickly. Rachel's touched on this. The 2019 electorate that came across the Conservatives were fundamentally different to groups that have been attracted before. The midpoint of gains in 2019 was in Sheffield, about 100 miles north of the usual midpoint of the Conservative Party in Buckinghamshire. Social grade, about 42% C2DE. In terms of education level, about a 37-point lead over Labour on people with no qualifications, about 5% below on graduates. And that impacted their views. So, as both Rachel and Matt have said, 60% of those new voters favoured investing more, raising taxes if it meant investing more in the NHS. About 41% said they favour cutting taxes even if it meant impacting public services. So the argument about the relocation of the Conservative Party to recognise those new voters is grounded in a real understanding of who that electorate are. They are slightly to the left on the economy and slightly to the right on culture, as Matt said, although I'll come on to a second. I think we need to be clear about what slightly to the right on culture means. The first point, we need to have some humility about who the electorate are and where they are right now, and be guided by that, even if the selectorate of the Conservative Party is going to guide the debate over the next couple of months, rightly and understandably. Quickly on this balance between liberty and belonging. So there's been a lot of discussion about freedom and opportunity, of course, absolutely central Conservative values, and one which have been part of every successful Conservative coalition that has won a big majority. But they've also combined an element of belonging, and we did some work in 2019 looking at that balance between freedom and belonging, and we found that about 2/3 of Conservative voters, when asked, would favour security over freedom. And now there's clearly a relationship between those two concepts, and there are different forums in which security and belonging play out. But there's a reason that there's been more support for security. And in fact, as Rachel talked about, the Brexit debate was one about security, that we can restore a sense of belonging to this country into places which previously have felt buttressed by international markets and decisions beyond their control. It was a return to the local and a sense of belonging in communities, which led that. And I think a lot of the anger that's been directed towards the government has absolutely been about individual elements of misconduct, but it's also been about an attack on that belonging, security and authority by various institutions, whether that's attacks on the government, attacks on forums like the BBC, attacks on the church. It's seen to unpick some of the elements of our national fabric, the values and the institutions that underpin the union. And I think when it comes to the sort of culture wars and war on woke, we conflate a couple of things. And so I think Matt is absolutely right that issues around the institutions that bind us together and their importance matter, and matter more to Conservative voters. They care more about the village hall, about the church, about the local parts of their community. And therefore, when things like woke stuff gets involved in the education of their children, they are bothered about that. I am not sure that extends to some of the more extreme examples that currently populate the debate about mixed-sex toilets or issues of transgender identity. I think those things are distractions and are seen by members of the electorate as not prioritising the things they care about, which are cost of living, the NHS and the economy. Where this party talks about culture, it should talk about it in terms of those institutions that bind us together, as opposed to wedge issues that drive us apart. And let me quickly talk about the state. So there have been a lot of discussions about the size of the state. The state is too big. I'm very happy to say, both from an onward position and from a Will Tanner over my shoulder position, we all believe that. But the question should be therefore about both fiscal discipline, absolutely, but what we want a smaller state to do. And there are three things I think haven't been discussed that need to do with that: state, Firstly, about governance. We are a woefully centralised country, and just because the majority of metro mayors currently happen to be Labour, there is a real disinterest in the party more broadly about how we can push power down to mayors, to councils, and to parish councils. We need to rediscover that because it's part of the new agenda. In terms of attracting capital, a fantastic CPS paper recently about how we can attract more international investment, which promoted probably a more active role for the state, not intervening in markets, but in doing what Ireland have done and being very clear about how we are going to attract international firms. That's the sort of thing the state should be doing. It doesn't happen when you just slash and burn departments. And finally, in terms of industrial strategy, we shouldn't be as nervous as we are about recognizing that modern markets need more guidance in order to solve some of the informational challenges that are inherent to modern economies. We need to be smart about how we do industrial strategy, and that's something the state should do. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, that's an awful lot to chew on. I'm sharing this, so I'm not going to chip in too much, but I think one of the fascinating things for me, I mean, I wrote a thing yesterday, and have said that it is wonderful to see the sort of pro-business, pro-investment agenda sort of coming back, and everyone talking about corporation tax cuts, and like that's not a weird thing. That is absolutely necessary for long-term growth. But it strikes me one of the sort of things which has emerged during this campaign is, I've written in columns about this. When Liz and Rishi were having arguments at the cabinet table about tax rises or spending, whatever, the Sunak position that first you balance the books is an impeccably conservative position. It was actually Margaret Thatcher's position. The Truss position that no, you can cut taxes and let the deficit take care of itself is an impeccably conservative position. It was Ronald Reagan's position. These are both strains on tax and spend that have been within the party for a very long time, and there were sort of powerful arguments in favour of both. What's interesting is that this campaign seems to have definitely polarised between Rishi, who is still saying, let's get the fiscal stability stuff done, and everyone else who's much more on the cut taxes, slash the state, and something efficiency savings. So I'm being slightly cheeky to provoke debate, but I mean, has the panel been surprised and pleased or displeased by where the debate on tax is going? I mean, I'm obviously very, very happy we're talking about lots of the things CPS has been talking about.
So it's a very necessary debate, and I'm not sure I would agree actually with how you put Margaret Thatcher's position. To be honest, I think she was responding to the politics of the 70s, which had been a politics of non-spending control, and therefore
yes. But so Charles Moore has a very good thing about Thatcher. As Thatcher being British, believed that things were going to get worse, so you had to kind of put your house in order. Whereas Reagan, being American, believed that things were going to get better, so you could afford a better.
I mean, my problem with this whole debate, to be honest, is it isn't enough to say our new voters like higher taxes and higher spending, so we must respond to that. Politics is also about persuasion as well as acceptance, and this country faces very serious economic problems. We've taken a massive hit to productivity over the last 15 years. There is no way back to changing that does not involve reducing taxation, reducing spending, bringing competitive forces to bear, and bringing free markets to bear. And anyone who says there is fooling themselves. Maybe we can get an electoral boost in the short run from pretending that's not a choice, but it is a fundamental thing about economic reality that free markets, smaller state, lower taxation produce prosperity over time. That is what we want. We want prosperity. So I get frustrated when people say there's a kind of choice between responding to what the red wall wants and responding to what traditional conservatism wants. There isn't a choice there, I don't think. The task is to make politically acceptable and attractive the only choice that there is. And that's why I personally think, and why I think this election campaign is good despite everything, is that To make free markets acceptable, to make the churn and everything that goes with it, you need community, you need institutions, you need the nation state and the sense of belonging, so people are willing to take the short run difficulties of it because they're part of a project, a collective project that is going to get better. I don't think you can have either free markets or the state in isolation. You need both to make them work. But to say there's any alternative to free markets is a false choice. And I just think it's a false road to go down, and we shouldn't be tempted by it.
Well, I mean, whatever order people want to go in.
So I suppose, and others can tell me I'm unfair, I don't think I have heard either that argument in an intellectually credible way so far in this race, nor have I heard any way of delivering it in a way that is likely to work with the electorate. What I've heard so far mostly is we will not go ahead with planned tax rises, which in and of itself, it seems to me, is not going to magically change our growth rate right now, and pay for with some sort of efficiencies that I refuse to spell out because I know that it's going to involve politically difficult choices. I've heard nothing that describes really how we are going to deal with a monumental growth and productivity challenge at a time of rising inflation and cost of living crisis. I have heard nothing that explains how we are going to manage a monumental NHS backlog at a time when we are giving it more and more money and seem, we were talking about this, to have no plans for reforming it. So while in principle, I think David is right, of course, as a politician, you need to make an argument and try and persuade people of that argument. We don't only go into politics in order to say whatever the electorate wants to hear. But this isn't it. And again, going back to my earlier point, I mean, there is a reason why the Brexit campaign won and a reason why the 2019 campaign won. I think we have largely, not entirely through our own fault, COVID happened, we've largely wasted that 80-seat majority and have very little to show for it. I'm stunned that none of the leadership campaign candidates seem to be even willing to talk about the programs they started. We have the entire levelling up department behind one of the candidates, and so far I haven't actually mentioned the things they've been working on for the last 2 years. So if you're going to have that argument, and if you think you can persuade, have it. Don't just say you're not going to do tax rises that might be coming through in the autumn. I don't think this is good enough.
You shouldn't do those tax rises, isn't it?
Yes, sorry. And as a CPS board member, of course, you shouldn't do those tax rises. But that's not going to change our growth path right now. We don't have them right now.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to David's argument, obviously, and but I do think that the party still is in this very difficult position of having inherited many voters that do think fundamentally differently about the economy from the Conservative Party. And the blunt reality, and I appreciate many people might disagree with me, but we are still living with the consequences of decisions that were taken in earlier decades. And the brand of conservatism that emerged, during the 80s to address the problems that were left by the 1970s made a series of decisions for very sound reasons and and they had many, many positive effects. They made the country much more prosperous, more dynamic. I don't need to rehearse to this audience the benefits of those reforms, but they did come with costs, and they came with very significant costs, not just in Britain. So in most other Western democracies, in economics now, there is a broad consensus that what you might call hyper-globalization had very disproportionately negative effects on working class voters and non-graduates, and was not accompanied with the compensation for those groups that should have been delivered in order to keep them on side, or at least give them a fighting chance in that new economic world. I view levelling up and the new conservatism, the post-Brexit conservatism, as partly about trying to get to grips with the fact that it has to deliver low taxes, free market, small state, alongside a program that can better provide some of that support to communities that, for very good reason, historically have struggled to adapt to that economic environment. I completely agree that the big challenges facing the country are currently absent. I'm stunned that we're not talking about giving the NHS and social care 190 billion without serious, significant and sustained reform. I think that should be all over this leadership campaign. Every single voter today has a story about GP surgery or ambulance not turning up.
The stuff this morning about the ambulance system being in process because of the heat wave.
Yeah, and this is really, you know, bread and butter issues: social care, productivity, levelling up, turning it from, you know, what it is currently into a very serious, interesting strategy that could be aligned to our large and growing productivity gap in the country. So all of that stuff I completely agree with. Where I would push back on the culture woke point, there is a tendency among some Conservatives to say, well, this is a divisive wedge issue that we shouldn't talk about. Women's rights, to me, is not a wedge issue, right? This is a mainstream issue that people want to talk about. The politicization of children in schools is not a wedge issue. This is about how we raise and develop and cultivate the next generation. And when you look at issues like providing parents with greater oversight over what their kids are being taught, to reforming universities so that we have a greater range of viewpoints within those institutions, to reforming organizations, the BBC, among others, to ensure that they better reflect the wide range of voices in British society who clearly told us through the vote for Brexit and then the vote for Boris Johnson that they want to be in the conversation and they're sick of being ignored. Those are mainstream issues to me. And when Conservatives say, well, this is culture war politics, what you're actually doing is adopting the language of your opponents. It's not a culture war to talk about nation, family, identity, women's rights. And I do increasingly get exasperated with the way in which these issues are framed as culture war politics. They're not culture war politics, they're mainstream issues that people want to talk about.
Can I quickly? So on culture wars quickly, so I think there's much that me and Matt agree on, and I'm at risk here of creating a wedge issue between the two of us.
Fight, come on.
Of course, women's rights are a mainstream issue. I would just suggest, in terms of prioritizing how we should support women's rights, that the phrasing of NHS pamphlets is less important than the rising and very high challenges of violence against women and girls, that there are ways that you approach these very mainstream issues that are more or less divisive, would be my view on that. But let me talk about economic strategy, because I think this is really important. And I think Lord Frost highlights a really important debate about what the role of economic strategy should be over the next 20, 30, 40 years. I do believe that lower taxes, freer markets, a higher level of competition, although it's interesting that the Digital Markets Unit was kind of watered down and moved away from this government. But I think that all those things are absolutely important. But there's an option here between two growth models. One, which is primarily sort of free market and redistributive model that recognizes that some areas will not be economically competitive over the long term, and therefore we need to do more to support those by redistributing forms of taxation through public services or elsewhere. By the way, that is the best version of that growth model, and in previous generations that redistribution hasn't occurred sufficiently to recognize that free markets are not operating in the way they should. Or there's a second model which recognizes that the state needs to lean in order to support economic growth. And it does so through investments in infrastructure, support for R&D, through having strong institutions that can support growth in those areas and ensure that many people can benefit in universities, in local government of various forms, either metro mayors or trade promotion bodies. You can call that second model of growth a sort of levelling up model. And it has to be that model because, you know, I absolutely agree that politics is about persuasion, but I am unsure that a case to people in Burnley, Barrow and Bishop Auckland that free markets will improve their high street and improve their law will be a successful one, unless the argument about the benefit of the market is coupled with interventions to allow them to participate in and benefit from those markets. Markets do not work, and no Conservative has ever believed that they work without appropriate forms of regulation and support relevant to the challenges of the time. And I think that's part of the argument that we've missed. So I would really argue that we need to move towards that second growth model that recognises there are forms of intervention that support people in places, usually outside London in the southeast, and not move back to an easier model, which just looks at the macro national picture and says that we need to cut taxes and slash red tape.
And we should obviously remember that Conservative MPs, the leadership candidates are at the moment talking to Conservative MPs as their primary audience. So we shouldn't be surprised if by some of what they're saying. if we can move to questions now, because we only have Lord Frost with us for another 15 minutes, and I suspect some people will want to ask him some things. We've got a microphone at the back. The gentleman at the front is very keen to raise his hand.
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to the panel. I thought it was a brilliant discussion, and it led me, however, to the unfortunate conclusion that surely a Conservative Party leadership campaign is the worst forum of all in which to discuss major policy issues. It is, first of all, it's too short, has to be short, far too compressed, can't explore anything. Secondly, it creates a series of false binaries between the market and state intervention, woke on the one hand, no, you should do something about the NHS on the other. We know the art of being a successful Conservative is essentially Orwellian, the ability to believe two contradictory propositions at the same time. That is the success of the party. We should not be binary, and unfortunately leadership campaigns are like that. And finally, it's the wrong electorate or wrong electorates. We have Conservative MPs at the first hand, party members on the second. Neither of these are the people to whom the party as an election winning machine has to directly appeal. So I suggest we all pack up our bags, go away, find out who the new leader is in September, and then start a proper discussion.
Well, so just on that, it's interesting that both Rachel and I tried to make the case for a longer leadership campaign, give it a bit of space to breathe, allow the candidates to introduce themselves to the people, find out a bit more about what they believe, give them some space to make some gaffes, have a proper policy debate. Absolutely got shut down. Just no, every single MP was just get this done.
Yes.
But just on that, I wonder if this will actually come back to haunt the party, because the last time the Conservative Party had a serious leadership election was 2005. I mean, 2016 and 2019 were overwhelmingly about Brexit, and it was where you stood on Brexit. And ultimately, the Conservative Party is debating what kind of party it wants to be in this post-Brexit era, in the same way that the US Republicans and the French right and the German right are all having a very similar discussion about, what does this underlying transformation of electoral politics mean for the right? And I just wanted to echo, I think it may come to be seen as a historic mistake, actually, just compressing this debate into such a tiny window.
The lady at the back there.
Hi there. I know Lord Frost has spoken to this a lot about OSB in particularly, and the online safety bill, apologies. What do you think the Conservatives will do or should do about OSB under a new leader?
Shall I answer that? Well, I mean, I think it's an ill thought out bill. I mean, and its intellectual sort of predecessors, if you can dignify it with the word intellectual, have been knocking around for 5 years or so, and things have been bolted onto it over all that period. I just think it's a moment to pause. I'm not saying that there's nothing in there that needs doing. There are definitely things in the bill that there probably is a consensus about and could be taken forward, but there's a lot in there that I think is quite misguided and quite risky. And I think the best thing would be to pause and reflect and make sure we get this right. It'll be quite difficult to undo some of this, given the real world kind of political economy of the way these things are done. And it's so important to get this right. So I would rather we just paused, thought, worked out what is genuinely consensus and what isn't, and proceeded in that way. I don't think it's conservative to be restricting free speech other than, in extremely defined circumstances, and this bill seems to be doing it. So I'm not particularly happy about it.
Anyone else want to answer? I mean, I think it's the core principle of you should judge the companies haven't had great moderation of the internet content in the past, and you should judge them on the quality of their moderation regime rather than individual decisions, is absolutely the right one. But it's got so crafted down with a whole load of things which could be potentially quite damaging to free speech and the economy.
I guess I just make two sort of connected slightly broader points, which is there seem to me to be a lot of pieces of legislation over the last few months when the government was, to be honest, more concerned with saving itself, I think, than scrutiny of what it was doing. Schools bill is an obvious example for me that we just need to stop and think again when we've got a grip, which brings me back to the delivery point, like we actually need to grip the things we're trying to do and pay attention to them. I also think, since if I'm going to burnish my right-wing credentials for once, we seem to me to have sleepwalked ever more in the last few years into giving enormous power and latitude to regulators without what we were doing, without beginning to understand how those regulators are incentivized to act. And I'm very concerned about it. I think we are almost ending up at the point those regulators will have more power than elected ministers. And again, it's something that a serious delivery focused government would pay attention to.
I completely agree with the opposition to the OSB. I mean, I was working with colleagues to try and help design the Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill. And we sort of found ourselves in the strange position of, on the one hand, actually pushing back against the rise of sort of a very oppressive orthodoxy and this sort of new obsession with emotional safety among our students and faculty. And then on the other hand, sort of reinforcing that very culture through the OSB. And I think this is symbolic of a broader lack of intellectual coherency to the Johnson premiership, whatever you want to call it, this sort of conservatism that was in such a rush to understandably get Brexit done, but then sort of got there and wasn't entirely sure what it wanted to do with the country. And you know, other members on the panel will know this better than me, but I suspect that really is rooted in just the lack of intellectual stewardship that was around Johnson during that period. But now there is an opportunity, and I think some of the candidates, you know, have already made it clear that they would scrap the OSB instantly, and I think that would be very welcome.
Next question, Phil Aldrich.
Yeah, Phil Aldrich from
just for the millions watching at home.
Yeah, Phil Aldrich from Bloomberg. I just wondered if the panel thought that the person who wins the leadership battle, this is going to be a poison chalice for. You've got, you know, 2 years before the next election. There's going to be economic weakening more than likely over the next year. As Rachel was talking about delivery, 2 years to deliver a lot of the things which have just been rhetoric so far. And separately on this point about institutional power, I just wondered if the Bank of England is going to come under greater scrutiny in future under any Tory leadership or even during the campaign.
Adam, you haven't gone for a while. If you've got thoughts on this,
I'm going to deliberately dodge the first question, answer the second on institutional power. So to agree with Rachel, I do think that we've not consciously considered what role we want regulators to play in the broader economy. That is, I think, going to lead to more tensions with the Bank of England because there isn't clarity about the different role institutions in this country play in terms of monetary and fiscal policy, and particularly in terms of competition. One of the big benefits of Brexit is an increased or a reconsidered role for Competition and Markets Authority, and I'm not sure there's been a proper debate about what we want the CMA to do, what regulators do in other markets. So yes, I think those tensions will exist. There could be a creative tension in which there's a discussion about the role we want them to play, or it could be a damaging one, which is seen as government just looking to hit against an institution that doesn't agree with it. I think there's a creative version of the tension you've described.
And David, since you probably have to go in about a minute, if you were going
oh yes. I mean, the poison chalice question. I mean, having power is never a poison chalice. It's always better to be in power than not, in my view. And I think whoever gets it should do everything they can to use it effectively. Can I just say a couple of other things, since I do have to go? One, just on Brexit, I'm kind of encouraged. It's hardly been mentioned actually, and we're talking about domestic policy, but I do think, and I said something about this on Twitter last night, that, you know, the debate about this is more that we now are moving on from the debate about what did you vote in 2016. It's about, have you got the right policy prescription to make it work for the future? And some Remainers have got that, and some Leavers have, and some Remainers haven't, and some Leavers haven't, it seems to me. So the important thing is, what is the policy prescription? Are we going to get that change of direction that we need out of this campaign? Two issues not mentioned much so far. I mean, there's so much kind of going wrong in the country that it's almost everything needs debating, really, and I think that's one of the problems with this campaign. But Two things not mentioned much. One, immigration is hardly getting a mention other than in a very lip service kind of way. You know, if we are going to reduce numbers, as I think we do have to over time, how are we actually going to do that? There's a very big question behind it, and a lot of people want to know the answer, I think, particularly amongst our new voters. And second, again, only lip service being paid to the whole energy net zero debate, very sort of simplified version. Can we take VAT off energy or whatever? But actually there is a very, very serious underpinning problem to the way the economy is working if we are imposing very, very high energy costs and suboptimal technology in a modern economy. And I know why people don't want to debate that, but it still needs to be debated. So, and with apologies, I'll stop there and I will have to go. Sorry to desert you.
Can I build on that briefly?
Sure.
I think David's absolutely right to point to both of those issues. If you look at 2019 Conservatives, their second top issue after cost of living is migration. It's a really still a big concern for the party. They feel that it's being managed badly. About 3/4 say they feel it's being managed badly. And this is the tension between the sort of liberal lever, sort of Johnsonian vision of migration and the more culturally conservative outlook of many of the party's new voters. So I'm surprised leadership candidates haven't dealt with that more directly. And on net zero and sort of environmental issues, I think one of the things that has come forward is a sort of emerging discussion around how far will the party go on things like environmental levies and changing the way in which we're applying some of those taxes to people. I know from some of the survey work that I've been doing that there is a really interesting avenue around that debate that the Conservatives may end up walking down, that actually people are nowhere near as comfortable with environmental levies as we often believe and we're often told. But we can perhaps talk a little bit about that, and some of the other panelists may have thoughts on environmental levies.
Yes, so we've got loads of people who want to ask questions, and you'll be reassured to know that one of my rejected column ideas was why Andrew Bailey will be the next leader of the Conservative Party. To sort of make exactly that point, you were kind of just like, it's about like monetary policy is going to.
But can I come on really quickly on the Bank of England, because it does seem to me that like base one of the next Conservative leader is they need to demonstrate that they know what they are doing and they are focused on delivery and they are getting on with the job, and consuming the next couple of years on a massive fight about the independence of the Bank of England seems to me to be crackers. Like this, it's the point about distraction again. You want to be heard talking about the things that people understand and that matters to them. So you want to be talking about bills and wages and immigration and the NHS and the backlog and can you get a GP appointment? This is basic stuff. We can't get massive
inflation.
Yeah, but having a fight with the Bank of England is not going to be the way in which you convince people you have a plan for inflation.
We got the fight on the panel. Lots of people want to, so can we go sort of 1, 2, 3 here at the front, and then we'll come to John next. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm Simon Camomile. I think a number of points.
If we could just have one.
well, the population of Britain is who we're talking about, and 80%. This is polled sort of reality. See themselves as middle class. So we've got 80% of the population, and that is an enormous opportunity for the Conservative Party. Let's talk about those people and not all the stuff that's been going around. We had to do that. This election and the new government is an enormous opportunity for Conservatives. We can reset. And there are some good, despite Kimmy Badenoch and others are talking actually very constructively in some areas. Whether she's elected.
So can we have a question, please? I'm sorry to be rude.
The question is shale industry, the energy is actually fundamental to this to this nation at this minute. And the shale industry could potentially be a phenomenal growth engine. And I would like somebody to talk about energy, because we need to get the price down and sustainable.
and then the gentleman here, and then the gentleman here. If we just try and bundle things together. So.
Simon Khan. There seems to be agreement on the panel that there needs to be a debate about policy. And there's also an agreement that there needs to be a lot of delivery on things that don't need to be discussed as policy, like GP appointments. There isn't a counter argument to that. And I'm wondering whether actually what is needed is to choose a leader who is capable of conducting the debate and delivering after being elected, rather than trying to have an argument, trying to choose a leader who has already decided what those policies are and conducting the argument prior to that decision.
Migration and economic prosperity. I, in this very room, launched after Brexit a paper on how to reduce migration in the fair, flexible and forward-thinking migration issue. And setting up the centre for migration after that was really to follow on and monitor what people's feelings were about immigration. One thing I've noticed very clearly about those who communicate with me across social media through emails is how they feel that the defenestration of Boris Johnson was firstly a plot by those on the Remainer camps to try and remove somebody who was seen very importantly to those in the red wall seats as achieving some of their main aims. And one of the main aims there was that of immigration. And as Lord Frost just briefly mentioned, most of the candidates, apart from Kemi and Suela to an extent, have come out and said, we'll support the Rwanda deal, but have been really quite silent prior to that in what they want to do. And the feeling that I'm getting through those voters, and I communicate mainly with the Midlands and the people and the North, is that they feel that this is a battle for the heart of the Southern MPs and the Conservative Party, who see economics and the fear of the Liberal Democrats beating their seats, rather than their views on the cost of living, which you quite rightly identified, the NHS, immigration, and as you said, also that of levelling up. But immigration is something they're ignoring. And when you will see this year approximately 200,000 new people come to this country, who will cost around £40,000 per person in the first year, which is around 6 to 8 billion. Do you think that the Conservative Party are running frightened from this issue and are sticking more towards their concerns that it's about Liberal Democrats defeating their seats and the economy?
A lot of things to get there. Though I should notice that note that Boris Johnson ran a really high immigration strategy once he got into power, and was very, very keen on skilled, talented migration. So if we go from Adam across.
Yeah, so I want to take this last question about immigration, and I think you're absolutely right. So I think in the Midlands and North, immigration on the doorsteps in the focus groups we do is an issue that comes up again and again. I think the other issue that comes up again and again, where the Conservatives will be vulnerable at the next election and continue to be vulnerable, is on crime. So although there was a commitment to 20,000 more police officers, and there has been increased recruitment of police officers, since 2019, the proportion of police officers that are on the front line instead of in back office roles has decreased. There are now more numbers of police officers in back offices because there's less of an interest really in the kind of minutiae of delivery around how policing is done, and more of an interest in hitting that broader number. And that's a real problem we hear when we do focus groups, mainly around antisocial behaviour and whether people feel safe to use public transport to go out on the high street. It's a vulnerable flank, not only because those are two important issues that hold together the coalition from 2019, both the Red Wall and those southern seats, but also because they're mainly arguments about competence. There's probably going to be very little contestation about whether crime should be lower or whether immigration should be lower. I think they will probably try and say that it should be lower than it is now. So it's about who has the ability to do that. And I think the reason Conservatives have been quiet on it, as well as what Robert said about the fact that it's quite a high immigration policy, is that where there have been attempts to cut down on immigration prior to Rwanda, but also in terms of the delivery of the Rwanda intervention, competence has not been the strong suit. And that's also been true on crime. And it's unfortunate that both those things sit within the Home Office and might explain why a particular candidate did not run. But I think that is going to be a real weakness in the next election on crime and immigration. I'd be surprised if that wasn't a core pillar of what Labour run on.
Yeah, I agree with everything actually that was just said. I think the Conservative Party sort of has to really ask itself a question as to whether it is a party that is going to be comfortable with running net migration at 300,000 plus for the foreseeable future. Now, as I'm sure Robert has already pointed out, and the CPS have pointed out, this debate has to take place alongside the broader demographic challenge that's facing the UK over the longer term, that we are now a rapidly aging society, and the debate about long-term economic growth and productivity is inevitably now going to become even more tightly connected to the question of migration and how we manage migration. And I think going back to a lot of the polling and the research that we did on the Leave vote, clearly, and I say Leave vote because the Conservative electorate is now overwhelmingly a pro-Leave electorate. Those voters overwhelmingly wanted lower migration, and they were also, we've run experiments on this, survey experiments, they would overwhelmingly, they say they would happily have the country be a little bit less prosperous if it meant they had lower migration. Now that's an experimental finding. Whether, of course, that would translate into reality, it's an open question. But for some voters, they don't simply view this question through the lens of GDP and through the lens of the economy, which is something to be mindful of. They also, my working hypothesis is they also haven't quite yet realised what is actually happening around migration policy and the extent to which Britain will rapidly become much more diverse culturally, ethnically, religiously, because of the changes introduced by Boris Johnson. So you've got this new migration policy that obviously is now drawing much more migration from outside of Europe, less migration from inside of Europe, and that will very visibly have an impact on the country in the next 5 to 10 years. And lots of that impact will be very, very positive, and it will make an enormous contribution to the economy. For many voters who now vote for Conservative, it will also, I suspect, have a profound social and political shock for those voters, and that will have consequences for the Conservative Party. So this issue is not going to go away. My final point is to really add something to the point about focus groups in the north versus focus groups in the south, and also Stephen's point about this being a contest for the southern soul of the Conservative Party, and I've heard much the same. Red Wall MPs actually say one of the fundamental problems that they have had is with southern Conservative MPs saying, well, we're not really that interested in levelling up. We don't see it as a sincere, interesting policy exercise. How am I actually going to hold my seat in Surrey or Hertfordshire or Hampshire? And this tension has to be resolve for the party to better connect itself with the electorate that it now has.
Well, I mean, Southern MPs have traditionally seen levelling up as an excuse to take money from their constituencies and give it to the North. But,
I completely agree with that. I am ashamed to say I have been surprised by how little many MPs in the Conservative Party seem to have understood their own electoral realignment in the last few weeks. And I thought actually Ben Houchen's proposals, I don't agree with all of them, but I thought they were sensible and a way of trying to inject some concreteness back into this, because those seats are still going to ask, what was in it for me? They're not emotionally wedded to the Conservative Party. This is a practical decision on their part, as it should be. I guess a couple of quick things. I know there are lots of questions. There's a sort of cluster of questions in this corner, if you like, which are broadly about, is this leadership election a bit of a disaster, and would it be better if we said as little as possible? I suppose I have two opposing answers to that. I agree with the rest of the panel that there are some pretty fundamental decisions that have been elided over in the last year of chaos that need to be made. And our fiscal position is one of them. But I also think that someone who is serious about being Prime Minister for more than 2 years would be saying as little as possible in order to keep their powder dry for the next manifesto, and so that they can orient themselves to the electorate rather than just their colleagues. That said, one of the things that I think we often misunderstand is how different Conservative members are from the electorate. I retweeted some opinion polling last night, and actually the priorities of Conservative membership are really not very different. They care about the bills and the NHS and immigration and small boats, they are as uninterested in many of the things that are occupying this debate as the electorate as a whole. Very quickly on energy policy. So a couple of things. The current Prime Minister was a big fan of fracking and dropped it down a hole because he was convinced that it was going to lose some seats. And the reason he was convinced it was going to lose some seats was not because people were anti the idea of us having gas, but because they thought it was unsafe. And recent polling I've done suggests that that has not changed. So if a leader wishes to be brave enough to say that we are going to frack and it is important for our security and these are the seats we are going to do it, and I don't mind if we lose those seats, you know, in principle, there's no reason why we couldn't frack. It's perfectly compatible with net zero, but I have yet to see anyone who is willing to take that political hit, and it has nothing to do with net zero. More but on energy bills, actually, I did a paper last year calling for some of the costs on energy bills to be removed into taxation, because they are extremely regressive at the moment, and it would be an obvious way to help people manage their bills. That is a separate question from whether you are still trying to pursue renewable energy as one of the ways in which we A, hit our environmental targets, but also B, become more secure in our own energy supply. The only thing I would say is I've yet to see any polling that suggests that the majority of the country, whether they are Conservative or Labour, young or old, do not support net zero and think that renewable energy is a good thing. So it is not obvious to me that this is an electoral win, regardless of my own personal views on it.
Just to clarify on that latter point, so completely agree on net zero, but on environmental levies and the tax implications of that.
People like reducing their bills.
I think there's, yeah.
I mean, like the British public are the most committed to net zero of any country. It is the country in which it is the least partisan divide. Like in America, Australia, anywhere else, it is a left-right issue. It is absolutely not true here. However, among both Conservative and Labour voters, the attachment to it is absolutely skin deep if it involves their own gas bills going up. I mean, I think that's
yeah, and I think, I mean, the obvious point, sorry, I don't want to have a huge energy thing. I'd be delighted to have it. The point is, the reason bills are going up so much is because gas prices have gone up. It's not because of energy costs on bills. But if you wanted to move them into general taxation, that seems to me like a very sensible tax cut that you pay through borrowing that immediately makes an impact on cost of living. It's an obvious offer.
Right, we're running out. We have run out of time, but I'm just going to ask one final quick question. Feel free to dodge it if you want. So who will win? Who should win? Or if you want to chicken out, if you want to chicken out, what should they be talking about that they haven't already?
You're going to go to me first.
Yeah.
I'll answer your question if you answer it. Are you going to answer it?
No.
No. Okay.
Actually, well, actually, yes, I am, because I have a good answer.
Go on then.
I'm going to say Rishi Sunak could win because I put 150 quid on him at 100 to 1 2 years ago. So it purely in my own financial interest.
Oh, that's a pathetic answer. I'm not following that. So what should they talk about that they haven't talked about? Every single one of the top priorities for the British public, which are cost of living, the NHS, immigration, high streets, crime, all the things that continually are at the top of the public interest trackers and are going to really matter in the next election. And two, I would like to be convinced that whoever is the next Prime Minister is actually able to take a grip and deliver some of the things that they've already promised day to day. You know, where are the hospitals, for example? So those are my two criteria, and I'm completely going to duck your first question.
Well, on I'm a numbers data person. I mean, on that side of things, who do I think will win? I suspect it will be Sunak versus Truss or Morden in the final round. Who do I think should win? I think I've made no secret of the fact I'm very intellectually interested in Kemi Badenoch's campaign. I think she's very compelling and interesting. The issue nobody's talking about but needs to desperately, I mean, as a country, we need to, productivity, it's at the root of so much. We just need to get a serious strategy in place.
I'm also going to dodge the first question. I'll just highlight the fact that both Tom Tugendhat and Kemi Badenoch are former Onward Advisory Board members, which makes you none the wiser about where we sit ideologically, probably.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is that there are too many former CPS authors in this race for us to.
Of course. I'll let you have that one, Rob.
It was free ports, wasn't it?
Suella did free schools, Rishi did free ports. We like freedom. That's our.
I clearly shouldn't have done that. Started the think tank wars on the panel. On the question of what they should be talking about, so I think policy-wise, they should be talking about how they're going to restore economic growth to places where it's been lagging, and they need to make that economic growth real. And they also need to talk about how they're going to restore the social fabric, a sense of belonging in places where it's been fraying. I think that sort of pride of place argument is one that's been completely lost in this debate, and it is hugely electorally important to swing voters in places that are needed. But I think politically, so that is what I hope they'll talk about. I don't think they will, because they don't have huge political salience with this electorate. They need to answer who they think their electoral coalition will be in 2024 and what issues they think will unite them. Because we've put forward an answer. We think that is the elements of the South that will still stay Conservative, although there's been a blue drift over the last 20 or so years. New seats in the red wall that were won in 2019, and additional seats that have the same factors as the red wall that could be won in the next election. You win then with a form of economics that's broadly aligned to levelling up and focusing on cultural issues like crime, immigration, and the importance of institutions. If that's not the answer, there needs to be a clear answer, and I haven't heard one politically yet.
But thank you all very much. I'll just chip in my comment on this would be housing, which no Tory MP wants to talk about, no Tory voter, no Tory member wants to talk about, but my God, we need more of it. And it was quite depressing to see Sajid Javid, the only candidate who had said anything substantive about housing, crash out of the race, potentially because he said something substantive about housing. On which dispiriting note, thank you so much to Adam for filling in for Will. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to Rachel. Thank you to David.